All right. Good night, everyone. This is a live weekly program. It's our first program, myself and JB. So, for obvious reason, this show is called JB and Salim, right? Joel Bagudin and Salim. And I know, Joel, you're no stranger to what's happening in Guyana and being visible and managing the narrative sometime. So, how's it going? I know you talked about this initiative for quite a while with me, and teaming up with me to kind of talk about what's happening in Guyana and so on. So, how have you been? And how was what are your thoughts on this, the launching of our own brand, so to speak? So we can talk about what's important, and like we said, going beyond the headlines.
Well, thank you, Salim, for agreeing to come on board with me on this initiative. This is not an overnight initiative. It's something I've preconceived a while now, about a year ago. And if I'm to tell you what motivated that, back in 2017, when I finished my master's, I started to write a column on the economy and finance, carried in Guyana Times, a weekly column where I dealt in an academic way with many topical issues on public policy, financial matters,
Hmm.
macrofinance issues, development of the country, national development, and all those national cross-cutting issues. And I still actively write analyses and viewpoints in that regard. And to date, I've written more than 300 articles, because
Yeah.
2017 to now is a pretty long time. So you would have built up a volume of academic work, I would say.
Hmm.
Um, During that time, I also used to teach part time, and a lot of the work I've done through my column, because it's based on analyses and data and done in academic style. I use it to teach. Since 2020, and now Guyana becoming a petroleum economy, a petroleum producing economy. The country is quickly moving in a different direction, in a
Okay.
positive light.
Yeah,
And so,
and with all the writing that you've done and a lot of the analysis that you've done, I think with technology and more people are more plugged into videos and they want to
exactly,
multitask.
precisely,
You at work and you
precisely.
want to do your work and you want to still listen to a video and see what's going on in the world. Uh, so it's only natural that much of what you've been doing in terms of the writing and the analysis and the commentary, that you kind of move that to where the audience is, or where the people is, and the people are online, and I think it's only natural, and not only natural, but I think it's where it's going. I mean, right now, I think most Guyanese, if I'm not mistaken, based on my research, are on a digital platform. They don't read newspaper much. Not that they don't read, but they don't read it a physical newspaper. They read it on Facebook. They read it on whatever news they're getting it online. So it's important that while everything is transitioning online, that this might be a reason for other things to go online too. Uh,
Precisely. Like I said, I used to teach, and now I don't have the time to teach. But this is This is something to
this is teaching,
replace
man. This is
my teaching
teaching.
activity,
This is teaching. Going
right?
beyond headlines is
Um,
teaching, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
because when you have a skill, you don't want to give it up. You want to keep it active. So that
Mhm.
is one motivation, and the other is exactly what you have just said. Recognizing that a lot of I mean, you're familiar with most of my writings, and I write very long articles,
Mhm.
and so I've recognized that a lot of people don't read. They don't like to read. They don't get the time to read. They
Yeah.
don't have the time to read more than one page. And so what the primary intention and objective of this is to take the work, all my writings, current writings, previous and recent writings. This will be the verbal version of that, a verbal presentation, a video presentation of
Yep.
some of the issues I write on, which I think will engage the audience and the target audience more effectively.
Yeah, yeah. And again, I think the intent of this discussion forum, this conversation that we're having. And again, it's not going to be only me and you alone. It's going to be me
Right.
alone, and we're teaming up with some other people who'll be coming on ever so often to give their perspective on things. Because I think as Guyana economy is evolving and Guyana society and people, a lot of younger folks are getting into business and entrepreneurship and politics. I think it's important that a dialogue be maintained at the highest level in a very civil way to ensure that we understand the issue, we discuss the issue, we look at it from different angle, we look at different people's experiences in dealing with these things. And by the way, for those who are listening, and I know we're online live, so if you know share this live video to your friends and family. We've got some great things to discuss today. Of course, we're discussing rising cost of living, and that affects everybody in the world. So we're on Facebook, of course, every week on Tuesdays at 7 p.m. We are also on YouTube live, and of course, we love comments, right? We love to hear what people are thinking, what they're saying, what their thoughts are, what they're hearing from other people. What they believe the leadership of the country, what they believe the business community needs to be doing or considering. So post your comments. We are going to be looking at those comments and of course discuss them. I think more importantly, what these shows do, the one that we're doing and probably others also, is to create this reservoir of discussion and a movement that's looking to re-engineer, redefine, looking at meaningful ways of structuring Guyana, because Guyana is being reshuffled right now, and there needs to be that discussion at every level, to ensure that Guyana can be put back into place, with this new economy that's developing. But Joel, our topic today is, of course, the rising cost of living, and how should policymakers tackle and arrest this? I know you've written on it, not only once but multiple times, and much of your writing and what you've been commenting on does address this to a large extent. Because at the end of the day, um, you know, uh, macro financial discussion, talking about development, talking about what policymakers need to do, is all about creating that good living, right? That happiness that a government is mandated to do. So, and I know, maybe you can lift off from that angle, from your article, and let's look at what are the underlying causes of the global cost of living that's also affecting Guyana. Guyana is part of the world, right? I know one big thing globally, and especially in America and Canada, is for the first time in a generation, we've got high inflation. You've got some cases 5 to 7% inflation, and that is driving a lot of the pricing and a lot of the living conditions uh, around the world. So that is one thing that's putting a cap on how much we can spend, and of course there's other factors. But I just want to uh, let viewers know that one important fact at the global level is that the world has never seen this level of inflation in about 30 years, probably, or maybe 40 years. But what commentators are saying, it's a generation. One generation have not seen this kind of inflation, and of course, inflation added with other factors that you'll be talking about, doesn't create the best of condition for cost of living. So give us some thoughts on what are some of these underlying things, and of course, we're going to be looking more fundamentally on what are some of the remedial consideration that the government and the private sector and others can, even at the individual level, what we need to look at.
Right. Thank you for that, Salim. Now, before I explain what are the drivers of the rising cost of living that we experience, um, to put it simply, naturally, the global economy, the world economy, and economies in general go through what you call growth cycles, the boom and bust cycles, as the economists, the economics terminology for it,
Mhm.
right? So you see there are periods of growth in some economies. The growth period could be, um, sometimes it could be short, it could be short-lived, it could be long. Then there is recession, and then there is depression, and and there are many case
Cyclicity.
studies of different periods of economic crisis. Historically, in the U.S., there is the Great Depression. More recently, with the exception of the pandemic, we've had a global financial crisis in 2007, 2008 that had systemic consequences globally in Europe, in parts of Asia, particularly originating from the United States, where that was triggered by the housing market crash. Um, we The Caribbean region felt the effects of the 2007 crisis largely because um, most of the Caribbean region are tourism driven economies. And so a lot of the market was from the US market, right? US tourists going to those regions. And because of the crisis, people held back on spending. They would have experienced massive losses in savings and their investments. And so the regional economies, though they were not directly um, part of the consequences of that crisis, they felt the impact because of their economies, depending on people coming from the US
Correct.
to their economies. Guyana was not in that particular crisis. Um, Guyana was not affected, and the reason for that is because that was a financial market crisis,
Correct.
right? Which then triggered an economic crisis, right? So Guyana, except the other countries in the region, was not affected largely because our financial market, our local financial institutions and commercial banks had minimal or zero exposure in the US market. We would have been affected if, for example, when you look at commercial banks' balance sheet and central banks' balance sheet, you see the commercial banks, they have a portion of their funds, their assets invested in securities. Now, those
Yeah.
securities are things like corporate bonds and treasury bills, government paper, commercial paper, which are financial instruments that they would have invested in to get a return which is higher than the return they might get locally in terms of interest rate, or higher than the return you get in the domestic market,
Yeah.
treasury bills. So we had minimal or zero exposure, and so we were not affected, right? And also too because we're a heavily cash-based economy. In this particular instance, though,
You're saying two things that didn't affect Guyana at that time. One was that we were not dependent on a tourism sort of market, and
and we
secondly,
had no exposure. Our financial
correct.
institutions
So we
had
weren't
no
plugged in. We
exposure.
weren't plugged into the American financial
Correct,
system.
correct. If we had
As
investments, we would have been affected. It would have affected our domestic financial market,
yeah.
right? But that was not the case, and so we had 2007, 2008, that financial crisis
So
where
we
the
missed
world
we missed that hit.
economy,
We missed that hit.
yeah, the world economy only started to recover probably around 20. The world started to see signs of recovery in the US in around 2011,
15.
12, 13, and so
Yeah.
on, right? So we were not affected by that global economic crisis, that global financial crisis. And if you study all the different economic crises in different parts of the world or global crisis and its impact, they're all, the origin is different. Um, the nature is different, and so the type of policy intervention, the type of responses are
Mhm.
also different.
Correct.
um, More recently now, what is affecting us more so is the after effects of the global pandemic. We had the pandemic which emerged in 2020, I believe in March 2020, or earlier in December, January, of that year. Um, it started in China, then it went over to other parts. I think it came to Guyana in March 2020, and so we saw the impact of that, where the entire world went into shutdown for 2 weeks. Now, the origin of this crisis is different. This is a health crisis, which which resulted in an economic crisis. When you have economic crisis, you have social crisis. So the world economy went into many economies in the world
Hmm.
shut down. Millions of people globally died. So we had to have responses from a health perspective, and there were responses from an economic perspective because there were economic consequences. And when the world economy shuts down, it means everything shut down. All the businesses, all the producers, all the manufacturers shut down. And so, because of that prolonged shutdown, where economies even look right here, only now after 2 years, um, or thereabout, we're seeing the Trinidad economy is now opening up. Our president recently, just a few weeks ago, fully reopened our economy, and that is because we would have, um, I think we have met that target of immunization of our population, where more than half of the population were administered um, the vaccine, and more than half of the population were also tested. So from that standpoint, I think it was a safe decision, data-driven, evidence-based decision to reopen the entire economy. And later on, as we continue this conversation, we would see why that is important.
Hmm.
So, coming now to the drivers of the rising costs, it is the after effect of that pandemic, the results of shutting down. When the world went into shutdown phase, people still needed to eat and to consume, and even though
Correct.
they were shut in, right? And so, if you're not producing the goods, there is no supply chain effect naturally. And also, you had people, because of the pandemic, people go into panic and
But
start to
but
buy
but
up, because nobody know how long this is going to last. So people, out of panicking, they're buying up a lot of goods to stock up in the event you run out. So that led
yeah,
to supply
and
shortages, and when
and
you have
if
supply
I'm mistaken,
shortages,
I think
prices go up.
if I'm not mistaken, I believe Guyana was one of the earliest countries actually to open up its borders. In the entire Caribbean, even in the U.S. and Canada, they were still shut. And Guyana, I think in
Yeah, and
October of 2021, that's when Guyana, of course, with restrictions, but kept their airports open and the ports open and so on, so that economic activities would have continued. Of course, we've got certain big sectors in Guyana that needed protection or access. You know,
correct. And
so I think that might have helped to also ease some of much of the pain that we've had today. I mean, look at countries like Trinidad, which is the average person is just crying out that everything's been shut down. I can't get out. I can't get in. I can't move around. I've heard some real horror stories out in Trinidad, and of course, I travel a lot, and I went to Canada, and it was hell. But I know the president and the leadership averted an even bigger catastrophe, by ensuring and putting restrictions in place to open up, and in a very managed way. So I think that might have, while it contributed to that global cost of living, and even Guyana cost of living, it could have been worse. You know what I'm saying? Instead of being where it is today, it could have been worse. If imagine if Guyana had opened up only 2 months ago or 3 months ago, what would have been the picture?
Definitely. And because this was, I would say, a unique pandemic, the entire world economy, responded. Um, the response to counter to cushion the effects, stimulus packages, having in
Mhm.
our case, we had a number of fiscal
Correct.
and monetary measures from the banking side, from the financial sector side, from the fiscal side, the cushion the effect. And I think that has largely helped um, our economy in particular to bounce back very quickly. And the fact that we are on the path of massive expansionary growth driven by the oil and gas sector, and some aggressive development project and so on, which we're going to talk a little bit more. I saw earlier today too, Salim, that someone post on the comment thread. They want to understand why is it 1 year ago they went to survival and paid $25,000 for a
Yes, yes, right.
specific basket of goods, and now when they go and pick up that same basket of goods, it costs, they got put back stuff. And if I'm to share my own I mean, none of us can escape the cost of living implications. All of us
Yeah.
are
It's the
subject to
widest
the cost
possible
of
net.
living. And if I'm to use a personal example, Salim, you asked me just before we went live, how are things with me. A lot has happened. I got married. I got a baby daughter the
Congratulations
other
on the
day.
baby. That's right.
um,
2 weeks
and
ago,
and
3 weeks
using
ago.
that example, my personal example, I could recall my wedding, um, which was only last year. The amount of money that I expended on food, and a wedding is a much bigger is a relatively big function. And last weekend I had a small function for my daughter, right, which is not as big as a wedding,
Correct.
and the cost for the food and the preparation for that was 3 times greater than the cost for the food and those other expenditure for a wedding function. Imagine that, 3 times, right? So that's how um, massive this thing, and then all of us are
Hmm.
experiencing the implications of it. And to come down to answering the person's question specifically, so it's unprecedented, and it's a complex issue. So the supply disruption is one which we talked about, how the pandemic led to supply shortages. When you have supply shortages and an entire global supply chain disruption, prices naturally go up, right? Then there is another dimension to it as a result of the pandemic, where shipping costs also went up. And if if you're to permit me, Salim, I just want to read one paragraph from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development report on this particular matter, where they studied this issue and published a report. And where it says rates to developing regions more so than the developed regions skyrocket. And the report read, the impact on freight rates has been greatest on trade routes to developing regions, where consumers and businesses can least afford it. Currently, rates to South America and Western Africa are higher than to any other major trade region. By early 2021, for example, freight rates from China to South America had jumped 443%, compared with 63% on the route between Asia and North America's eastern coast. Part of the explanation lies in the fact that routes from China to countries in South America and Africa are often longer, more ships are required for weekly service on these routes, meaning many containers are also stuck on these routes.
Mhm.
When empty containers are scarce, an importer in Brazil or Nigeria must pay not only for the transport of the full import container, but also for the inventory holding cost of the empty container. Another factor is the lack of return cargo. South American and Western African nations import more manufactured goods than they export, and it's
Absolutely.
costly for carriers to return empty boxes to China on long voyages. So that is another dimension coming out as a consequence of the pandemic to explain the rising shipping cost. And in international trade, shipping cost is a large accounts for a large um, a large portion of your overall cost, right? So that explains. So those are two things coming out of the pandemic that explains why the prices went up by almost three times in the supermarkets. Now there is a third explanation, um, Salim. The third explanation is because this is now specific to Guyana. That early explanation is how these global eventualities, these global external shocks,
Mhm.
as economists would call it in terms of the economic jargon, but we already break it down for the average person to understand what we're speaking about. Um, Coming now specific to Guyana, there are a number of things that we could have done or we can do in the short, medium, and long term
I
to
noticed. I
to
noticed in talking about some of the issues that's
Mhm.
impacting the rise of cost of living. I noticed you didn't mention one very major global event, which is the war.
The war,
Great.
yeah, yeah. The
You know, I
war
think
has
that
just compounded the issue exactly.
exactly,
The
exactly.
war just the war just compounded the issue, right?
Yeah.
And so these are the
But
global.
briefly, how does the war all the way, 15,000 miles away, Ukraine, how does that affect Guyana's cost of living? I'm sure that it does, but maybe for clarification to our viewers,
Well,
how specifically?
the simple example is we in Guyana we consume a lot of food product made from flour, and the raw material to make flour is wheat. And Russia is a major um, global exporter of wheat. In fact, they account for 30% of the world um, production of wheat. So even though we might not be purchasing our wheat from, using just this one example, the
Correct,
other
correct.
commodities. So even though we may not be purchasing directly from Russia, why is it there is rising costs? Again, supply and demand economics or
You'll be
dynamic,
competition for the other
right?
70% of it.
Exactly. So the other countries that are producing it, where we are purchasing from, there is higher demand for there because Russia, because of the war, they were sanctioned by many countries. Economic sanctions were imposed upon them by
Mhm.
the US, by perhaps the entire European continent, or most countries in the European continent, and several other countries across the globe. And so the demand for the wheat produced in other countries went up. So there is supply shortage, so prices go up. Um, I see though, um, commendably on our part, our policymakers' part, we are now looking, studying how we could start
Do
to
we, right?
produce wheat, right?
Yeah.
And our population is a population that we love our flour product, bread, roti, you name it,
Mhm.
right? But these things, part of the responses, these type of these eventualities, these scenarios, that impact our daily, our livelihood and our lifestyle, it naturally imposes upon us behavioral changes, lifestyle
Absolutely.
adjustment. And in fact, this was one of the resultant effect of the pandemic, where there is, because the nature of the pandemic, there is behavioral change of consumers, where a lot of people working from home, And so the demand went up for tech e-commerce, for technology devices and so forth. And so demand naturally went up for manufactured products. And more than 50% of the global manufacturing products are transported via shipping,
Correct.
right? And so that impacted the cost for shipping. So, there are short-term ways of responding to it. But if you were to ask me how long I think we would take to recover from the effect of the pandemic, where we're experiencing the cost of these what economists would say imbalances. When will we come back to stabilized prices? When will the world economy, when would global supply chains and demand reach an equilibrium level again? It might take another 2 to 3 years or 4 years, depending on how other countries, in other countries across the globe, how quickly they reopen their economies, and so on. So the point I wanted to make before, on the Guyana case, we are feeling the effect in a significant way, in a tangible way, largely because 90% of the goods that we consume, be it food, be it clothing, or other intermediate goods, we import because we do not produce it here. So naturally, if we have to import, when you go to the supermarket, the ingredients that we use to cook in our food, the on the manufacturer side, the ingredients that they have to use in the raw materials, they have to import it because we don't produce it here. So naturally we are subject to those increased costs which we have no control over. Versus if we were producing it here, then that is a different matter. We'd be able to
Mhm.
to minimize the impact of these external shocks, these external global events, like we had in the 2007 crisis. It did not impact us because we were not exposed to it. So that is why it is important, the investment programs of the governments, on the government's agenda, to bring down energy costs, the gas to shore power project. Right now, as I'm speaking live on this program, I'm live simultaneously in another program where I was part of a panel discussion talking about the gas to energy project and the benefits. That's running live because it was pre-recorded, so I'm not acting. I'm not a magician.
Premiering, as they call it, say, right?
Right?
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Hey, but stick a pin on that one on the manufacturing thing. Of course, it's never a nice place for a country to be dependent on the outside on imports. And of course, as you mentioned, Guyana is heavily dependent on imports. And I think this is where maybe there's an opportunity also, because I know the current administration, through multiple measures, whether financing measure, whether infrastructural measures, and those kind of things, they're looking at boosting their manufacturing base in Guyana. Where and I know it might not be an immediate resolution to high cost of living, but it's certainly a good time to kind of start that discussion on how do we bring more manufacturing and more exporting of what we manufacture to the Caribbean and neighboring nation, because
right,
I think some of the key ingredients that is required for a robust manufacturing sector, we're now beginning to see it happen. Whether it's lower cost of energy, whether it's better more financing, a more reinvestment in certain key sectors like agriculture and so on, which is our advantage. So it is manufacturing, like so many other considerations. um, I would assume that would be not only address the key issue of keeping production in Guyana, but it's job creation, it's creating economies and around the country and so on. Is that something you believe the government needs to be really focused on in terms of providing the leadership and the incentives to ensure that that sector start producing locally and become an economic, a bigger economic source.
Definitely, Salim. Now, as you raise that issue, now let me now delve into the the response measures. Let's talk firstly about the measures that the government has been at the policy level have implemented, and some of the programs. Then we can talk about suggested measures, and I'll touch on the exact um, suggestions you raise. Now, because this period of rising cost, which is not only affecting Guyana, but globally, and in our case, we're a little bit peculiar because later on I'll explain why we're peculiar, or the answer would come out naturally as I delve into these issues. In 2020, when the new government assumed office, they to respond to the pandemic already, they would have implemented a menu of measures which continued in budget 2021 and continued in budget 2022. On the fiscal side, in terms of reducing the cost of doing business, which ultimately translate to the reducing cost of production, which would translate to a competitive environment and competitive prices for the end product, which is the finished goods. Right? So a number, like for example, VAT was removed from data, VAT, you had VAT on electricity and water, VAT was removed on
Yeah.
those items. There are a number of other basic food items that attracted VAT. Those were reversed and removed and so on. A number of,
I can
I don't want to
imagine
get
what would
into
have happened. I can imagine what the state would have been
if
if
we didn't
those.
do that, right?
I can imagine the
Yeah,
price would have been the price of your daughter's
might have been
program
six
and
times.
and your wedding if you had all those taxes in place. So
Yeah,
it's a good thing that
I might.
the administration removed all those taxes.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, definitely, definitely. Um, so we see now that because of the impact of the war in Russia and Ukraine, we have rising fuel costs.
Correct.
Now, we are enjoying the best of both worlds. Well, sorry, not the best of both worlds. We are enjoying both effects. There is a positive effect and there is a negative effect, right? So what we
Mhm.
have to do is take the benefit from the positive effect and offset the negative impact.
And both
And
are
that
oil.
is
Both
we
are
are
oil.
producing oil.
Yes.
So it means we're benefiting in terms of tangible revenue from the sale of crude on the high prices of oil. But because we don't have a refinery and we still have to import the finished product, which is fuel, um, we have to
Mhm.
pay more for that. And so we've seen, the tariff, the import tariff on fuel previously was as high as 50%. And through gradually in the last year and a half and within the last 2 years or less, that has come down from 50% to zero as part of the measure to stabilize or to cushion some of the impact of the rising fuel costs domestically. We've also seen that the president stated that there will be no increases in electricity rates and water rates because those entities would naturally incur higher costs. Fuel costs will be a high cost component of their operation. And so to absorb that cost, they would have had to raise electricity rates. And the president said, no, we're not going to raise electricity rates. So that means the government would continue to the
I mean, the electricity
subsidize
rate is already high. I mean,
the subsidize
how much more can you raise it, right?
exactly, right? So we've
Yeah.
seen those measures. We've seen some other tangible measures where, for example, I saw the vice president recently announced that they're looking at creating 8,000 part-time jobs as part of the measure to deal with rising cost of living. Now, and that is very, very commendable because cost of living, especially in this particular instance, is not a government problem only. It's not a problem for the government alone to fix. It's everybody's problem, and all of us have to make adjustments. That means at an individual, family level, household level, we have to look at lifestyle adjustment. We have to look at how could we cut expenditure. For example, if we used to go to the salon 4 times a month, we need to cut that down to 2 times a month. If we used to go to the bar every Friday, we need to cut that down to 1 time, right?
Go
And
on a
most
Monday,
of
you
it,
drink
and
less.
most of our population as well, most of our
Yeah.
population
Hmm.
live in rural areas where they have a lot of land space where you could plant your own kitchen garden. Those a combination of things, initiatives like that would help to cushion the
Yeah.
impact of cost of living on the expenditure side. Planting a simple thing as a kitchen garden. um, we have learned from the pandemic that we could work remotely. Employees, in the same manner how we've seen some people, some groups, and some proponents are calling upon the government that, look, these measures that you're looking at are not enough, you need to give us more and more. In the same way, you need to speak to your employers. In the COVID period, we were working from home, and that helped us to save transportation costs. Look at rotating it back again. Work 1 week from home, or 1 week you travel. If 3 persons driving to work, carpooling, all these are ways to save an expenditure. So at the individual level, there are things that we can do to complement what the government is doing. And then to touch on where you're speaking about the manufacturing sector, um, creating more opportunities for employment, more opportunities to generate wealth, to generate an additional source of income or revenue at a household level. We're seeing that is happening through these developmental projects, um, where, for example, if I'm to touch on I saw the proposal by the opposition to consider $200,000 every quarter. $200,000 every quarter to every person the age of 18. I mean, that might sound fantastic, and who wouldn't like the sound of it? Who wouldn't like something like that? All of us, anybody would like some, but the practicality of it, the feasibility of that proposal in a bigger context, you have to look at it, right? And I've seen comments as well that, well, the government is investing in a lot of infrastructure. Take some of that infrastructure money and give it out to people. Now, there is provision in the budget, the $5 billion provision to help to deal with these cost of living issues. But that was before we had a Ukraine war. So government already said that they're going to consult with the people, consult with stakeholders, and we have seen
Hmm.
action in so doing. We've seen there was an outreach in Linden by the vice president. There was another outreach in Barbados. And almost every week there is stakeholder engagement
It
at
is.
the community level to understand, which would then feed into the policy. Now,
Yeah, I read in your
so just to mention that,
yeah, I read in
let
your
me talk
article.
about.
Now that you mentioned it, I want to bring it up here. You wrote in your article that there's $5 billion allocation for cost of living, stabilization, and neutralizing that. Can you give us some details on that 5 billion? Where does that 5 billion go? And of course, you mentioned in your article that with the war and so
So,
many other things, it
so,
could be 10 billion. So where does
so,
that
so
5 billion go to kind of rest the cost of living issues?
now permit me to correct your choice of word, Salim. I wouldn't say neutralize, because
Attempt to
all
neutralize.
all the measures that because this thing is so unprecedented, we may not be able to neutralize or offset, but we could
Correct.
at least cushion. The safe word I would use is cushion, or to help to mitigate or minimize the impact. Neutralize, that is the desired outcome. but I want to be realistic in my analysis and discussion here. Now,
Correct.
that
Correct.
particular $5 billion provision in the budget, that particular 5 billion is what the policymakers have said they before they decide how to administer that 5 billion, they want to have wide stakeholder consultation to decide how they're going to administer it. Now, in 2020, for COVID pandemic and 2021, we've seen there were there was the $25,000 cash grant. There was a 250,000 cash grant to farmers when we had the flood,
Mhm.
right? So at this point in time, on the part of the policymaker, they need to consult to decide how they're going to administer it and through what mechanism. If you ask me, I would say that $5 billion should be allocated to help households. Now, in households, sorry, we in Guyana, we have just over 200,000 households.
Correct.
And with the massive housing drive, we probably close to 300,000. Now, $5 billion is not enough for all of the household. And all of the household in Guyana don't need that grant because we got to separate our high income people and our middle income people. For me, people in the middle income and high income bracket don't need it. Find a way, a mechanism and the data is there, the ministries and so forth. There are ways how we could accumulate this data. A simple application form, how many persons working in the household, bring your pay slip. Just like when you're applying for these subsidies for CX, you got to submit your pay slip and so
Mhm.
on. A simple process like that to just to ascertain if this household is a low income household, because in this period of high cost of living, the low income families are the ones that are going to feel the brunt of it more than the middle income people, because the middle income and high income people, they have savings and they're able to cushion the impact because of they have savings in the bank and they have multiple sources of income, or they have higher income than the average person. So I would say administer that 5 billion to low income families, whether it is a one time grocery voucher to help with your with household consumption
But
needs,
has the
right?
government been doing that? I mean, since for the COVID, for the flood relief, and so on. I think the government have been doing that. So that's almost like an idea that's tried and used and so on. Wouldn't it be better
Yeah,
to we look at minimum wage, for example, because that class that you've just described, that segment of our society, maybe their minimum
yeah, but
wage,
the distinction is,
increasing minimum wage maybe by another. I know they've increased it,
hmm,
but maybe increasing it, as part, because I've sensed from a lot of policymakers around the world that the first thing they look at when they're looking at cost of living is wages. How do we ensure that the lowest income of us are getting enough to 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 um to catch up when it comes to inflation. So inflation is 7%, 6%, 5%. Then
def-
minimum wage should at least cover that gap.
now definitely, Salim. Now the thing about, of course, every employer, every organization, and every government want to pay the people decent wages,
Mhm.
or better wages, right? But wages, to pay wages, you have to generate revenue. So, how much wage and salary you could pay is dependent on how much revenue you could generate sustainably. In the case of companies, there are prudential benchmarks, financial best practice benchmarks in terms of how much revenue should account, what percentage of your revenue you should pay your employees,
Mhm.
and that percentage by global standard is 15 is a low of 15% and a high of 30% of revenue, right? So the biggest companies like Exxon, for example,
It's
or the
50,
big four
20%, yeah.
companies, they don't pay more than 30% of revenue. Um, their
Precisely.
employment cost is not in excess of 30% of revenue that they're able to generate.
Mm.
So wages and salary could only increase based on how you're able to sustainably increase your revenue. The same is the case for the government, for public sector um, wages. Now take out oil revenues, right? And look at your traditional revenues. The total employment cost um, in the public sector as a relative to revenue is 30%. Now, by best practice standard, that is the highest the government could afford or any organization could afford sustainably, right? If, for example, total employment costs was less than 15%, well, then you can say, well, government didn't pay in proper wages and salaries because that's ridiculously low.
Mhm.
It's not even within the minimum benchmark of 15%. So if you're with 15% is low, between 15 to 30% is reasonable, 30% is the highest. By
Yeah.
financial management standard, right? What is sustainable? So that is how, so as the country develop, as government is able to build out the economy, attract more investments, more companies coming in, paying more taxes, raising your organic revenue. That is how they can be able to sustainably over time raise salaries and wages. Now, let me talk about the oil revenues because there's a lot of commentaries and views by persons that, well, we're an oil rich nation now. Why we can't take the money? And there's one particular um, commentator who has this notion that the $9 billion to develop Yellowtail could pay increase wages by 100% or something like that for the next 60 years. I mean, those are um, ridiculous statements when you really analyze and contextualize the issue.
Hmm.
The oil revenues are, it is not prudent to use that to spend on consumption expenditure, recurrent
Absolutely,
expenditure.
absolutely.
Have to build out the
Long
economy.
term
Now
investment capital.
let me speak to this now in the context of infrastructure development because we've seen of the $552 billion budget, 40% of the budget is for capital expenditure. Capital expenditure are for the infrastructure development of the country, to invest in infrastructure, energy infrastructure, a mile, gas to shore, bridge, roads, and so on. And of that 220 billion, $126 billion, which would be the drawdown from the NRF fund, would go towards financing those capital projects. Now, there is a view by some in the political spectrum where there is a proposal that will be debated in the National Assembly for a $200,000 every quarter. That 200,000 every quarter, based on the proposal, would work out to in excess of $100 billion, almost close to 120 billion and change,
Hmm.
which is all of the money in the oil resource. Now, when we understand the peculiarity of the peculiar issues of Guyana, we would understand that those are short term measures. One, it is not addressing the root cause of the issue, how we could address this in the long term. And the third thing, it is not sustainable. What happens when you
Absolutely.
have an oil price crash? You can't sustain it. Suppose we go and we increase public servants' wages by 100%. Forget about, let's not, in the interest of time, we're not going to talk about the inflationary impact of that. But for the
Mhm.
sake of this of argument, let's say we take the all money and raise public servants' wages by 100%. Now, I'm sure every government would love to do that, right? But what happens when we have an oil price crash, an oil market crash 2 years from now?
Could
What,
happen, and it is possible. You
right?
know,
You
oil
can't
prices
sustain
are
it.
very volatile.
You can't sustain it. You're in trouble. You end up in bankruptcy. Everybody rich all of a sudden, and then by the snap of a finger, everybody into poverty. You
Yeah.
go bankrupt. So you
Mhm.
have to implement, financial financially prudent decisions,
Mhm.
prudent financial management decision, prudent fiscal
Yeah.
management in the context of sustainable development
I mean, yeah,
and
I
in a
mean,
sustainable manner.
I totally agree with you. I mean, handouts at a time when cost of living is high, A, is not sustainable. It's not. It doesn't make economic sense. But what I would like to discuss with you, or put over to you and the viewers, of course, is that the vice president went to Essequibo, talked about jobs. The president went to Berbice, talked about jobs and industries and so on. To me, Guyana, where it is right now, there is a golden opportunity to get people jobs like tomorrow and get them good paying jobs like tomorrow. Because, and it's already allocated in our budget. You said 40% is for capital expenditure. You know,
That will create
let's
thousands of
let's get on the
jobs.
road. Let's get
That
on the road. Let's build a road. Let's build the bridges. Let's create all these
the
jobs.
housing drive of 10,000 a year, that would create a massive construction boom. That is
Absolutely.
thousands of jobs in the construction
And
sector.
I'm saying, to me, that's the low lying fruit for the current administration to say, hey, we've got the mandate, we've got the money, we've got allocation, we've got the time is right for Guyana to go on this massive infrastructure development. I mean, you look at America's biggest development was after the Great Depression in 1930s, when America, there were soup kitchens on every block, and there was, the economy was just stagnant. What did they do? They just opened up infrastructure, start building 1,000 bridge, millions of miles of roads, trains, and so on. So Guyana, to me, can create jobs tomorrow by just saying, hey, let's build that road, let's get that bridge going, let's get this canal going, let's get this farming, whatever it is that's in the budget. To me, the government needs to just go and get it done, and it creates job, good paying job. It creates an economy around those jobs and those centers. I mean, look at it. I was in Guyana just about a week ago, and those new roads, I'm also already seeing that those new roads that they've built are creating an economy around them. So there's no doubt that you can do a lot of stuff. You can do a lot of stuff in the given environment, but the low lying fruit is what Guyana needs and what Guyanese need. Which is the infrastructure.
Yeah, and I want to make another point on that infrastructure where, you know, again, I'm going to reference the views of other proponents that we should take some of this infrastructure money we spending in infrastructure, and pay out grants. Now, I'm saying you got to deal with the root cause of the problem. That is not going to solve the root cause of the
Exactly.
problem, and that is not going to be sustainable in the long term,
I
right?
totally agree. Totally
Now, let me
agree.
address.
And I
Let
think
me
most Guyanese would
let
agree. Most Guyanese would agree, but because of political expedience, they want to say that.
Yeah. Let me give you an example, Salim, of how important is investing in our infrastructure, which the average person might not see how investing in infrastructure will reduce my cost of living. Now, let me give you this. Let me give you facts and figures here. If you could pull up that presentation I share with you and go to the graphs, go to the diagrams. Now, go to port infrastructure. Go up to port infrastructure.
Just so you
Now,
know, we got like 2 or 3 minutes more. We don't want to keep people going for too long.
yeah,
So,
so I'll
and we,
talk about this and
yeah,
then we're gonna wrap up in 5 minutes, right?
yeah,
Remember earlier I explained the drivers of this unprecedented cost. I talk about the pandemic, the shipping cost, and so forth. And I talk about, in particular, our region is more badly affected in terms of the rising shipping cost. And I would have read that, cited that paragraph from the United Nations Trade Development Report. Now, the solution for that, which was in the making before the pandemic happened, is what the World Trade Organization is implementing, right? A trade facilitation uh, strategy where in our case we have a trade facilitation roadmap, and that trade facilitation roadmap has begun implementation. That process was started by the World Trade Organization in 2013, I believe, and we signed on to it in 2015. Now, let me explain what is this trade facilitation strategy. The objective and the thrust of this trade facilitation strategy is to improve international trade, is to improve efficiency, reduce the time, and to also benefit from cheaper, lower the cost of international trade. And if you look at these diagrams where Guyana is versus its Caribbean counterparts, the number of documents to process exports and imports, for example, a good benchmark is a low number of three or five. We have
We have
about,
seven.
what is our number there?
Seven.
Seven, right?
Yeah.
So that's number of documents. Then how long it takes to clear a container. We have, if you look at one of the slide, we rank 133. Other countries are 5 days and so
Mhm.
forth. So this is the importance of improving our port infrastructure. That is one aspect to improve this as part of the trade facilitation strategy. And of course, then there is the bureaucracy, improving the processes, which could be done through implementation of technology, overhauling the internal
Mhm.
processes, the logistics, and so forth, where a number of stakeholders have to be engaged. And during my tenure in the private sector commission, I was part of some of those stakeholders. So the long-term solution to help to address, reduce our international trade costs, which a big portion of that is shipping costs, is to quickly, now more than ever, implement this trade facilitation strategy and roadmap, and to improve our port infrastructure, both shipping ports, as well as the airport
Yeah,
infrastructure, right?
absolutely.
So I wanted to make that point to show how important it is to invest in infrastructure, to develop the infrastructure, and the direct relationship to solving this issue of rising costs, because you'll be the rising
Absolutely.
cost
Totally
overall,
agree. Totally
which
agree.
which is transferred and passed down to the consumer. So that is that is the direct relationship,
Mhm.
and the same can be said for the other massive infrastructure development. When you build new road, you're opening up thousands of acres of new land, which can be used for residential development. Residential development creates employment. There is a multiplier effect of that.
Yeah.
Then there is commercial and industrial uses that also creates another um, series of employment and investment opportunities and business opportunities. Those are the long-term
And
solutions.
and and Guyana's third largest sector, which is being promoted as tourism, they depend on infrastructure in a big way. The reason why Guyana's tourism has been somewhat flatlined and been growing incrementally over the last 30, 40 years is because the accessibility of our infrastructure of our tourism is difficult and expensive. Guyanese don't use it. You've got to be a millionaire to kind of want to use Guyana's tourism product. So, well, I think we've discussed quite a lot here today. I think there was there's a better understanding, I think, by the viewers of what's causing this raise in cost of living. And of course, we made some good points that maybe the policymakers can consider, whether it's looking at infrastructure, looking at our shipping ports and airports, and whether it's looking at supporting a more robust manufacturing sector, or using energy and those kind of thing in more better ways. So I think this is our first show, and we've broken ice. We'll be coming back to you again on Tuesday, my JB and myself, and to talk about things that will affect, not affect, but it will promote Guyana's development, and that will promote Guyana's economic and financial development. But this was good. I think, JB. Well, any final thoughts as we close this inaugural show, and we plan for our next show next week, where we come again with some really hard hitting behind the headlines sort of discussions.
No, I think we have maxed out our time. I think this was a really good
Yeah,
discussion. Um, it is our first show, and I think the fact that both of us, we are not necessarily new in terms of doing these type of show. We started first in about 2 years ago on a different platform. So I think we'll be able to build a viewership very quickly so that we could get their feedback and have their interaction and respond directly to their comments and questions.
yeah.
So
And
thank you, Salim, for your time.
yeah, yeah,
And
it's definitely
to
a
viewers, good night to you, and have a
yeah.
safe week ahead. Safe and
Well,
productive week.
yeah, well, thank you, JB, and I'll see you again next week. All right.
All right.
Well, good night, everyone, and stay connected. Please share this video, even though it might be recorded. Like our page. We are on YouTube as well as Facebook. So subscribe to our channel and stay informed and be part of this conversation about Guyana's development and macro financial issues that we can all help to move Guyana forward. Well, thanks again and good night.